Hey guys, welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. Today I have with me Hannah Lee. She is a doctoral candidate in the field of counseling psychology. And we got a chance to have a conversation about her dissertation, which is on intergenerational trauma. It's a fascinating conversation. I had a great time talking about it because I think it affects our community in a very direct way. Our community, meaning the Korean American second generation. So yeah, thank you guys so much for tuning in. It's been a while, but hope you enjoy. Hey guys, welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. It's been a while, but back in a new house. We were originally supposed to do this in like January, right?
Mm-hmm. And something like that.
Yeah, and then we were trying to get moved in. We were doing renovations in the kitchen and all that, so it was rough. But we are here. Yes. The fan is going. It's really hot in this house, although it is February. So if you guys hear background noise, I'm sorry, but we will not be turning off the fan. I don't want us to get heat stroke in this room. So so Hannah, well, first of all, thank you for coming on, and nice seeing you in person, because it was like episode like 50 that we did it, maybe even before that.
Yeah.
And actually, no, maybe after, because it was during COVID, and we had to do it via Zoom.
Yes.
And so you're here in live for the first time.
Yes.
So I think last time we talked, you were like doing your PhD. You're kind of in the middle of it, but through social media, I'm seeing that you might be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel soon.
Yes. Yeah? Yes.
So can you just give us a update of kind of where you are? Yeah.
Yes. So I am wrapping up. I have about a year left. And so what that will look like, though, isn't kind of the traditional like studying and, going to classes and even seeing like patients or clients more infrequently. So what I have left is a 1-year clinical residency internship. And then I have my chapter 2 of my dissertation left. And so and then we defend that, and then they shake your hand. They're like, congratulations, doctor, blah, blah, blah.
That's awesome. So I'm sorry, just for a little bit of background, your study is in...
So I'm studying to be a counseling psychologist, but my research and clinical interests are for Asian American mental health at large. My dissertation is on intergenerational trauma for Korean and Korean American families.
That is such an interesting topic. So are you like interviewing people? Are you like, how are you kind of carrying out your research?
Yeah. So the chapter 2 of my dissertation is a randomized control trial. And so those are like big words, but basically I'm creating an intervention created to like help folks that have experienced intergenerational trauma or want to heal from that experience. And the research aspect of it is me seeing if my intervention was effective.
Oh, wow. So for those of us who are not us, for those of the people who are listening who do not know what intergenerational trauma is, can you kind of briefly describe what that looks like?
Yeah.
And because I'm assuming there's many types, but there are specific ones for the Korean American community, right?
Yeah. So at least in the field, intergenerational trauma is understood kind of as a conglomeration of a few types of traumas. Okay. And so there are historical traumas, that's kind of a category, and then there are things that are cultural traumas. And so a lot of this research, the literature, started with descendants of folks from the Holocaust. And so, right, like that's a historical trauma because of the historical impacts that it had on the Jewish people. And then for cultural traumas, on the ways that it impacted this whole like group, in a very different way. So historically, you see folks from that generation like move, and it impacted a lot of kind of their like ways of being, and then culturally, it really had profound effects on how the Jewish people experience their day-to-day lives, but it changed this like whole group of people, right? And so that's how intergenerational trauma is understood. It's when one one like lineage of folks experienced this historical event, but it had impacts for generations to come.
Wow.
And so the literature says that intergenerational trauma usually affects like up to 3 generations. And
Wow.
yeah, so there's lots there.
So people, grandparents of, or grandchildren of people who experienced the Holocaust firsthand, they would have a lasting impact because of what the grandparents went through?
Yes.
Wow. So in that research, what types of like trauma presented itself? Because they obviously didn't go through it firsthand, but like, so was it like the similar things that they were going through, or? Like...
Yeah, so it really depends, again, on the historical event, but something like that, right, such like genocide, right? It really impacts the way that you see well-being and quality of life. So a lot of folks are very like survival mentality, even that survival mentality, right? And we're hearing the themes of what might impact the Korean people too. But right, the way that you look at how to raise your children, right? How you prioritize what is important when you're rearing them. The mic is rolling away from me.
I'm sorry. Oh,
It's okay. You're good.
Yeah.
No worries.
Okay.
Yeah. I was like, whoa.
Sorry, guys. First time in a long time.
Tech issues.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. So, right, like, so when you are, even like, so when you're parented in a way where, like, you have to hoard money or you have to compete, be competitive, and everything is about financial security, right? Like, so, again, right, we're hearing some themes that might be applicable to us. When you lived in such danger and threat to your life and well-being, that is the way that it gets passed on. So a lot of folks that are generations past the actual historical trauma, folks are chronically stressed, which leads to hypertension and strokes, a lot of physical ways. But there's there's like an aspect of trauma called it's like the study of trauma, and it's called epigenetics. And so the descendants of folks with intergenerational trauma, their genes actually change too. Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So lots of things going on.
So not only is the things your grandparents went through impacting you mentally, but also physically as well. Wow.
Yes.
So okay, then let's bring this to the Korean American context, right? Because I believe some of us might have grandparents that kind of lived through the Korean War. Timing wise, I think it's So do you think do you see in the like Korean American community specifically that there are lingering effects of the war?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
So in my literature review, that kind of led up to me justifying why I was doing this intervention in the first place, even though it's like severely understudied. So some of the things that that are considered traumas is the Korean War, the Japanese occupation that was right before the war, and then even immigration. So right, and that gets a little bit complex because largely it's our parents' generation that are first generation immigrants. But that's kind of compounded trauma and it just introduces a lot of complexities.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So we already have trauma from the war and occupation and being so impoverished, right? Being so oppressed, and then you put into this like the immigrant experience, you know, that causes chronic stress and like feelings of marginalization, and then you have us, you know.
So what's the trauma that we're gonna pass down to our kids?
Woo! I think it depends. It really is. It goes from like the macro to the micro, but it's really ecological because all of that influences each other. I don't have kids, but for you, David, a lot of it is like difficulty communicating with our kids, right? And so even I had a couple of families that I was doing counseling with, and the language barrier is one thing, but I think the ways that are, you know, that folks that are in the parent generation and the like child generation communicate is so different, right? And a lot of that is the immigrant experience. Like first generation immigrants have such a different experience of their life in America as opposed to like our kids who are in elementary, middle, high school, you know?
Oh, gosh,
So there's a lot there.
Wow. So if we, as you're like interviewing people, are there things that, if the listener is a Korean American second generation person, things that they should be looking out for, things that kind of are like thematic in the way that we like live?
Yeah, so a lot of it is, so something that came up was, for the second generation, was over tolerance to distress. And that was specific for the Korean American community. We have that survival mentality that like, well, my parents suffered so much, they struggled, they didn't even speak English, but they were able to have successful businesses or, you know, what have you. So if I'm feeling really anxious, or if I feel lost, or if I feel depressed or anxious, you know, like whatever it is, I have to like grind my way through it or grit my teeth through it. And first, because that's like what I learned from my parents when they were in distress, but also I don't feel like I deserve to feel like I'm having a hard time, you know? So that is something that was really big that came up.
Interesting. So, because honestly, like I actually think, and this might be because of the way I was raised, but I actually think that in a lot of ways that could be like a positive thing, right? You know, because you know how like millennials, like our generation, we always get like made fun of. Oh, you guys don't have the grit. You guys don't have the grind. You know, so like when I see my peers kind of in our community, Korean American community, like who are able to power through certain things, I'm like, oh, that's because of the way that we were raised. So I've only like thought about it in like a positive way. But what are some of the like negatives of being too tolerant of those like distressing situations?
Yeah. So for me, and this is not like scientifically based, but in my own opinion, it comes up in two ways. First of them are obviously mental health issues. When you are having what is very clearly diagnosable mental health disorders, people don't, you know, access mental health care, and they feel like they should just be able to pray it away, or because, you know, a lot of us are in churches and those kinds of communities, spiritual communities, or they just feel like whatever, it'll be fine, you know. And then when those folks end up coming to people like me, mental health professionals, like the issue is this big as opposed to like, you know, it could have been like smaller, you know?
Right. Oh yeah, gosh.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, no, I'm just like kind of thinking back on my life, and there are definitely many situations where I kind of powered through things that I don't think I necessarily needed to. And I think that's probably what led up to like anxiety and things like that later on. So okay, you've convinced me.
Yeah, and a lot of that I think leads to unnecessary isolation as well. Right, because a lot of us have a tendency to kind of draw back when things are really hard, and it's a universal truth, right, that life isn't easy all the time. But when that happens, we don't access, right? There's like shame and guilt involved with wanting help, either from professionals or even from our friends and family, but it exacerbates those symptoms, right? So like anxiety and depression and low self-esteem, difficulty for advocating for yourself, even in kind of the professional spaces, which are very characteristic of Asian Americans. And so I think I like what you said in terms of like we want to be able to preserve that grit, but I think sometimes we swing too severe in the pendulum, you know? So it's like we complain about everything or we complain about nothing, and it's like a lot of folks are lost in the middle.
Yeah, and I think that is part of the Korean American experience. It's trying to figure out the middle, because we look at our parents and like they don't tell us anything. Like I'm sure some parents do, but my parents, I grew up thinking like our family and our extended family was all perfect and nothing was wrong. It wasn't until I became an adult where they started telling me about all this like family drama and like all the uncles and cousins and things like that. I'm like, wow, like you guys like just kept that all from me, and like all the like stress and everything. Like thinking back, there were moments where my dad like kind of would like blow up on me out of nowhere, and I'm pretty sure it was like built up stress, because like it was like something like a really funny story is like me, my brother, my mom, we went to Korea, we came back, and like the day we came back, I like sat on the couch, I turned on the TV, and the TV like just wasn't working, and my dad like blew up on me, like it was working fine before you came, like what did you do? And then later on we just found out the cable went out, and it had nothing to do with us, and I remember like me and my mom like sitting down like trying to figure out like why was he like, what, like is TV that important kind of thing, like he saw me for the first time in like 2 months, and he's never told me what the reason was, but I'm sure it must be something that like he was stressed out at work or something.
Yeah. Well, what was that experience like for you? Like having experienced him blowing up or right, like reacting. What was that like for you when you were going through it?
So I was in middle school at the time, and it must have been impactful because I still remember it. You know, like I like vividly remember it was at night. I remember it was at our like old house that we were living in. I even remember like what channel I was trying to watch. I was trying to watch Nick because Nickelodeon. Like I haven't seen American
Nick
TV.
At Night. It was awesome.
And like I need to watch some TV with some English in it. So I think it was like I don't necessarily want to say it traumatized me.
Sure.
Because I don't know if that's true or not. Like I don't know that it like, oh, like I'm like scared to turn on TVs now. Like it's like nothing like that.
Yeah.
But I guess it was an impactful experience.
Yeah. So like I would imagine that you were probably confused, that that would make a lot of sense.
Yes, very confused.
Confused and fearful, and so, right, because like this authority figure of the home and the household is having this like very large reaction, and you have no idea why. And when fear and confusion are mixed together, it does create for a very impactful experience. And so I'm not surprised that that's like a memory that has stayed with you, because it probably shaped the way that you like had previously seen your interactions and your relationship with your dad. But another thing that's like interesting is the one kind of lurking evil with intergenerational trauma is something called the conspiracy of silence. And so I think that is a very common experience for folks, that are in the millennial generation. Our parents didn't tell us a lot about what they were going through. But that, first of all, didn't mean that we weren't like aware of them being stressed or of there being tension,
Right.
but they're kind of lack of conversations with us about it, I think just creates this elephant in the room and this prolonged tension that leads to chronic stress, like especially when you're a child and you know that there's something wrong for your parent, like, oh, dad is not okay, like mom is not okay. They keep living with that anxiety until it's kind of communicated to them, you know? And obviously you don't have to tell your child like this from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. this is exactly what happened. Right. But maintaining this desire for silence in the home is actually very toxic for it. And especially to do with our traumas, our parents' generation or even our grandparents, for our parents, I think their desire to not tell them exactly what they've been through was to protect them. But it actually ended up creating this rift between the parent and child generation, even for adult children, where they never felt like they really knew or understood their parents. And in return, they never felt like they were known or, like understood by them too.
That is so interesting, because I guess another kind of trait that I was taught like observationally is like you don't really want to tell your kids that much. Like you want to, I guess the positive spin on it was always, I don't want them to worry unnecessarily. So like I could exactly like what you're saying. I could always tell when my parents are stressed out. I just never knew the reason. Even to this day, like most of their stresses, I'm gonna assume it was finance related, just because my dad was a business owner, but like I don't know, they've never told me. And I mean my kids are, Aisley is she's talking now and everything, so she understands, so I could communicate a lot with her, but I I don't think I should be telling her like, oh man, work was so stressful today, like every day or anything like that. But I guess I do have the ability to tell her like the things I'm like experiencing and going through. But I guess I only highlight the positive stuff. And I don't want to like I came back from a business trip yesterday, and it was like a 6 a.m. flight, so I had to wake up at like 4 to get to the airport and all that. But then when I saw Aisley, I was like, oh, I came early just because I went to see you. And then like I kind of just powered through the tiredness of like playing with her and stuff like that. But I'm sure she could tell like something was off because I was like laying down a lot and like not as animated when I play with her as I usually am. So I wonder if it would have been helpful for me to say, oh, listen, like I came back from I had to wake up really early, so I'm really tired, so I'm going to be a little bit slower today. I wonder if that would have been helpful.
Yeah. I think, because tiredness is an experience that Aisley probably knows what that feels like. And so, yeah, I think you modeled that really great. Like, Daddy is tired. These are the reasons why I'm tired, but I still want to play with you. I still am here. But like, right. So teaching a child to be empathetic, right? That's empathy. And they now learn how to do that with other kids, right? When they're able to have that kind of relationship with their parents too. I also am not a proponent of like, you should be friends with your children. You know what I mean? Like, guess what happened today at work, and what fill in the blanks. Right. But I think for them to just understand what is going on for you in a way that it still makes it connect back to the connection you want to have with your child. Like, I'm tired, but I still do want to be here, right? And making that really explicit. It teaches them empathy for you and for others, but it also teaches them how to communicate what's going on for them, right? So when they are a parent or with their colleagues or coworkers or their friends, they're also able to, right, communicate some of these things that I don't think we're taught very, intentionally, Yeah.
Wow. So I'm just as you're talking about these things, there are so many little things that I am thinking about that I do that is a result of what I've learned from my parents that probably they've taught me as a result of what they saw their parents going through. Yeah. So do you think, because I see just globally, the trend is usually something really bad happens in the country and there's a lot of immigration, whether it's like just immigration in general or like refugee situation, a lot of like moving, right? So are you aware of any studies that kind of look at the impact of that compounded generational trauma?
Yeah. So for the Korean American community specifically, I mean, there was mass immigration first, like right after the war, and there was also large bodies of immigrants in the 1980s, and so when there was immigration after the war, when it ended in 1950, it was a lot of brides. So a lot of Korean women who got married to American soldiers. So that was kind of the first wave of Korean immigration. I mean, Koreans have been here since like the 1700s, 1800s, because they were brought for labor to work on the railroads and stuff along with Chinese American folks. Right. But if you really want to kind of see it in like big waves, that's when it started in the 50s. And then in 1965, there was an immigration passed law, and it banned immigrants that were trying to move who weren't white collar workers, so doctors, engineers, lawyers, and so folks from working class were not able to come. And so when that was lifted in 1965, that helped a lot with immigration as well. And then in the 80s, right, there was a lot of economic things with the IMF and stuff like that in Korea, also a big wave of immigration. And so, yeah, when things have happened in Korea, there have been a lot of movements to the US, and we are sold the American dream, even that has a lot of historical implications in it, because America was seen as this like savior to Koreans, and kind of feeding from that narrative, I think Koreans were like, oh, there is hope, right? Because it was so difficult to live in Korea then. And then I think a lot of folks got here and experienced, also the trials and tribulations of being an immigrant, and that was hard in and of itself.
Yeah, gosh. So, I mean, you mentioned earlier that you kind of interviewed families.
Oh, no, for my study?
Or you've talked with families about things. So I know you can't get into specifics, but in your experience, what are some of the things that our parents are going through that we might not be aware of?
Yeah. So, like, one family stands out to me specifically. And so I was seeing them in, like, clinically, I was doing therapy with them. And they actually came because the two daughters in the family, were fighting like violently, and these are little girls. They're both in elementary school. It's a couple years ago, so second and fifth grade or something like that, but violently fighting. And when I did a little bit of just the intake process and talked to mom, so she had a history of like suicidal ideation and severe depression. And the mom and the two girls were living away from dad, who lived in Alabama, because he was working there, right? And so you already kind of see how these things could be really challenging. But when I asked a little bit kind of into the mother and daughter's relationship, she had a lot of the dynamic was characterized by like making them compete for her affections.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, you know, like if older daughter brought mom 귤, you know, tangerines, and was like, oh, like 엄마 피곤하지, 뭐 힘들지, and was like, you know, you must be tired. Like the next time the girls were fighting or needed to get in trouble, like mom would be on older daughter's side, or she would make comments to younger daughter, be like, why can't you be like her, you know, which is something we've also heard in different contexts, right? Triggering. And so it just created a lot of dynamics for the children's existence to be for the parent. And we see that even in our generation, right? Like I am talking to a lot of my friends now, who have, you know, we've been out of college for 5-6 years now. They've been working these corporate jobs in IT or, you know, tech and finance. And they're like, I did this for my parents. I was like, okay, complying when I was 19 or 20, when I was like first making my career decisions, but I like hate it now, you know? And there's now this like tension because they made life choices to appease their parents, and they're now realizing that it wasn't the right thing to do.
Is that like a uniquely Asian phenomenon, this like desire to appease the parents, or is that kind of universal?
I would say it's probably exacerbated in collectivistic cultures, so Asian culture. So it's not just Koreans, but right, like if just the Asian American population. First, because that is our like cultural foundation, right? Like Confucianism, like piety, family piety, and then, but also for immigrants, because like we see our parents having such a hard life, and that's also why, from their own right stress and trauma, they want us to go a path where they're not going on, you know. And so there's this extreme pressure for their kids, like don't be like me, but on the other flip side, for the child, they are witnessing their parents having a really hard time. Like my parents, we owned like a small grocery store for kind of most of my adolescence, and it was in a low-income neighborhood. And I've seen, you know, obviously the robberies, and like my parents have been held at gunpoint.
Oh my gosh.
And they didn't know how to like speak to the police, and so like even without them telling me, there was this witnessing for me of like, oh my gosh, like I don't want to live like that, you know. And like a lot of empathy and sympathy of like they must be having such a hard time, but they're not like sharing that with me. So even gratitude of their silence, and it perpetuated a lot of things even for me of like, I can't live like this, I have to be successful, and there's no room to budge there, you know. So
So there's a lot of reasons why we are the way that we are.
Right. Yeah.
Because I mean, it's anyone listening who's Asian American knows like a lot of their career, like where they ended up in their career, is influenced by their parents, right? You know, so do you think ultimately that's a negative thing, or is that a neutral thing?
Yeah, so developmentally, that is an area where you still need support and guidance. Like when you're graduating college, your prefrontal cortex have not completely developed yet. It doesn't do so until 25. And so there is a level of involvement that I think is still healthy, right? From your, especially from your parents, right? Because they care the most about you and your future and success and happiness. But I think it is right? Too much of something is always a bad thing.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And so, so if folks in our field call that enmeshment. This kind of, we're talking, there's language around what even the experiences that we're talking about. So Asian families tend to be overly enmeshed. And so what this means is like my emotional well-being, is tied in with your emotional well-being, and my status, right, as like a human is tied to your status as a human. So like when your child is a doctor or a surgeon or right works at Microsoft, it's like our parents identify with that, right? And yes, there's a level of that you can be proud of, but if your sense of like feeling important to others in your community is dependent on like what I do and my success, that's overly enmeshed. Yeah.
And is it true that that's not universal, right? In terms of like family dynamics, Asian Americans tend to be more enmeshed than like Caucasian families or other families. Is that true, you think?
Yeah. So I think folks from just more collectivistic culture, so even Black families have some of this, right? Definitely like the Latinx community, so it's mostly like people of color, and I don't want to say that like white families don't experience this at all, because if like parent in the family is experiencing abuse, there's some like interpersonal violence, then they have like those kinds of traumas also tend to be connected to like their overly being enmeshed with their child if a child acted in a protective role against the perpetrator of the violence. And so this can be enacted, right, for whatever reasons, for in a lot of different ways, but in more of kind of, I guess, like this systematic way where it is like a cultural norm. You see that a lot in more of these like marginalized communities.
I see. So, sorry, going back to your PhD, so I guess what you're trying to prove is that if you intervene, then these intergenerational traumas can be helped. Is that kind of the basic way of saying it?
Yeah. So my chapter 2 study is. So there were specific points of intervention that really came up in the literature. And mind you, there is really not much studied on intergenerational trauma for Asian Americans. So I was I was really stretching, but one thing that was really prominent was the conspiracy of silence, and how to intervene in that is making family communication more robust. And so part of that is so my intervention comprises of a psychoeducation component, which is like, okay, this is what happened in Korea, right? As Korean Americans, we feel so removed, right, from the Korean War. We maybe cry at a Korean War movie, but that's about it. But when you make it connected to your everyday life experiences and your relationships, right, that becomes meaningful for folks. So there's an aspect of it that's like, I do a small history lesson almost, and then I have an aspect of it that I explain what intergenerational trauma is, and then how it impacts like our generation. And then the latter part of it is this it's like a kind of like tools of how to navigate communication with your parents. And it's a tool so you can kind of get the ball rolling. It's by no means comprehensive, but my intentions are to see if like even like introducing these concepts is helpful in terms of like getting your like brain going and how you can facilitate these conversations, because it does fortunately and unfortunately end up kind of being on us to be initiative of these conversations. Because we are more privileged with like resources for mental health, being English speakers, right? Like having time to have these kinds of conversations where this can kind of be enlightened for us. And so, so my intention for my study is to see if the intervention that I created is effective in kind of moving that communication forward.
Wow. So you mentioned how like you do like a little history test or history test, a history lesson.
Yeah.
How important is it to know the history of like the intergenerational trauma?
Yeah. Well, first it provides like structure and context, so I think that's important. But also when I was doing my own, research into like these historical events, it was really emotional. It was really moving. There were more bombs that were decimated in Korea during the Korean War than I think in like the entire Asia Pacific during World War II or something like that. Yeah.
Oh wow.
And it killed about, I think what I read was like a third of the entire civilian population.
Wow.
Yeah. And so just the atrocities, right? And even the poverty, right? Like, because I have my own oral histories of like my grandma eating from the trash and like, and digging through these like rubbles and stuff like that, because she was a like little girl when the war was going on. Like I have these own oral histories of my family, but to know that this was on a like systematic large scale, that was experiences of like so many of our grandparents, like I am a part of that. I'm a part of that fabric. Like I look a little different because I lived in the US for most of my life, but I didn't feel removed as if it was somebody else's grandma. It's like, man, this is the history of my own family. This is the history of like my friends, like my best friends who I care so much about. Like this is our shared story together. And so I think knowing the historical aspects and giving it context like that is important for even how it impacts like me and us and my family and the immediate people that I care about.
Yeah. Do you remember there was this one Korean movie? Like a lot of people cried during it. It's like the story of a kid who is like looking for his dad because they get separated when like during the war, and then he like goes through a lot of like hardships to try to like provide for his family. Do you remember that?
I don't know if I watched that.
I forget the title of
Yu-Gi-Oh? I know a lot of people are very like I didn't watch that. I'm so bad with pop culture.
It was it was like there's like a store in Busan that's like that the movie like setting was in.
Oh wow.
Shoot. But anyways, I remember like I watched it with my church. Like, for some reason, like I think our samonim has like some connection with someone who like can get us like free tickets. So I remember watching it with our church and then like talking about it afterwards. And then the protagonist is like our parents or our grandparents' age guy who's like kind of thinking back to his life and like all the things like he had to go through.
Oh man.
And it's interesting how you were saying like when we hear these stories we don't completely feel totally removed from it. Like when I hear like Holocaust stories, like it's like really heartbreaking. I feel sad, but it does feel removed from me.
Yeah.
But when I watch that movie, even though I didn't go through any of it, I was like, oh gosh, like it's like hitting me differently on an emotional level.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And like I know the most recent kind of big wave was pachinko, and so like I read the book, loved it, cried a bunch, but I watched the show. I watched it with my boyfriend, and he was like so pissed when the Korean people were being mistreated by the Japanese. It's like as if like it was him that was being like kicked in the stomach and being disrespected and mistreated. And I like took a step back from that situation. I was like, oh my gosh, like there's a identification here that's happening for him, and his people. And I don't know if his grandparents were mistreated by the Japanese during the colonization. I don't know those things, but like there is an aspect of like I am you and you are me, and that's I think beautiful, even through really painful experiences.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's a drama called Mr. Sunshine.
Yes, I love that
Yeah.
drama.
And it's a lot about like the independence fighters, right?
Yes.
And I watched it and I was like, oh, this is like really awesome. Like I really relate to these people. But then after the fact, I remember like my dad was talking to my brother, and my brother lives in Korea,
Okay.
and he's a lawyer, and they were like talking about something, and my dad said something about like, yeah, I don't think we have any documents, so I guess whatever. And then he hung up, and I was like, oh, what was that about? And he told me like, oh yeah, he's trying to prove that his grandparents were independence fighters
Whoa.
who like went to Manchuria when
Yeah.
the like temporary government was set up.
Yeah.
And because like later on the government like they gave like a stipend to families who were descended from
Wow.
independence fighters.
Wow.
But I think my dad was trying to get that done because my grandfather, his parents had left, and he kind of like spent a lot of time trying to like prove it because like he wanted to like get that kind of like get the
Yeah.
recognition for
Heck
his
yeah.
parents. But I don't think he was able to. And then I think now that my brother's in Korea, my dad was trying to figure out what he could do.
Yeah.
So like that was like when I heard that,
Yeah.
like, even more
That's
so
actually
now.
so cool. Yeah.
So even more so, I'm like, oh shoot, that's like.
Yeah.
But like it's interesting that I still was able to identify before hearing that story.
Yeah.
Just because like, oh, these are my countrymen, and
Yeah.
and is that it? You think is it just because like, oh, they're from the same country as I am, or is there something in the intergenerational trauma that like links us?
No, I don't think I would say that it's a traumatic effect. I think first again, the cultural aspects of us being collectivistic is one of them, but there is something in like shared struggle, right? And so like even feeling like my grandfather is a North Korean defector, and my mom actually went on a trip to Korea for free, like really recently, last year November or December, because Korea sponsors a program where the children of North Korean defectors can go on a trip for free. They go to the Blue House, and they have all these like events
cool.
kind of set up for them, and it's clear that even the government, right, is like kind of honoring of these like shared struggle and experiences. And so I think that's like the really beautiful thing about collectivistic culture, right? Like there is a part of like I honor who you are, and the struggles that you went through, because like there is an aspect of my life that is improved because you did this for our country and our people. I think like again, too much of that too though is it can be a bad thing when it kind of imposes on like well-being, right? And so like I can only be well, or you owe me something because of the sacrifice that I made, right? Or because of the things that I've done. And so because it creates this like level of expectation and responsibility, and it's a hard balancing act, and probably a little bit more difficult for our parents than us. But now we have this responsibility of choosing to parent differently or interact with other people differently. And we're still kind of figuring that out. It's a process of navigation.
Yeah. And the other part, how like you were talking about your boyfriend being really upset at the scene with the Japanese oppression. So I think. So my grandfather, he would not let us eat like instant ramen at home. Even though like it's made from a Korean company, it's like instant ramen, like the ones we're thinking about, it's very Korean, right? But because of the fact that ramen originated in Japan, like there was something like really deep in him and like he wouldn't let us watch cartoons that were Japanese animation,
like anime. Yeah.
And so like. I kind of understand it from that perspective, but it's interesting because I still see people like our age, like some of them are like, oh, I don't want to shop there because that's the Japanese company, or like there are like, it's not like outright like racism of like they're inferior to us or anything like that, but it's like in very subtle ways, like where they try to like distance themselves from like something that's like Japanese. Do you think? Like, well, what is your take on that?
Yeah, it's complicated because you don't want to invalidate the experiences of those that were marginalized. So it's even like the black-white relations, right? And like, there's not one right answer because I think like for white folks, it's like it wasn't me that was your captor, and whatever. But we still live in a country where it's as if like the Japanese were still in Korea and the Koreans were still there. So I know the context is a little bit different, but you don't ever want to invalidate like the experiences of the people that were oppressed. But that would be our grandparents' generation, right? But like hate can be passed down too, right? And I think for me, my grandma was the same way. I think my first car, like I got a Volkswagen Jetta when I was trying to get like a Honda because my grandma was like, "Oh, over my dead body," you know what I mean? And so I was like, "That's really extreme and dramatic," but it was something that my dad honored, like her opinion in that, you know. So like, even though the Honda was cheaper, he was like, "Well, you know, we're gonna go look at other things," you know. And so, so I think like there's an aspect of like that kind of, I don't know, like beliefs and values that are passed on. But even with like the Korea and Japan relations, that's also complicating because there's still things going on like with current events, right? Like the comfort women and them never getting like an apology or like ample recognition that this happened, the systematic raping and even with like Dokdo, you know, like there's like it's mine, you know, it's like it's still happening to this day. And there's just, I don't know, it's completely gone, you know, and no level of oppression like really goes away, right? Even like within like white folks and black folks in America, there's still large gaps, right, in wages or access to resources and education, quality education. So I don't have an answer. But it is multidimensional, like a lot of things. But I think the one thing that I would stick by and would want to pass on to like my future children is that like my passing down of like hatred is not a good thing, you know? And I don't know if that oversimplifies it, but I don't want to like pass down my negative emotions about anything or anyone, right, to my kids.
No, because you said it so well. It's like it's such a interesting, almost like it's a very difficult situation, right? Because like you said, you don't want to invalidate anyone's experience, you know, and like like we're not so far removed that it's impossible that our grandparents who like we've met have gone through that kind of oppression, you know. So but again, it's like I get hate is not good. So it's one of those things where I really think about like how much of the history do I want to pass down to my kids? Like, do I want to make it, color it so that like they grow hate in their hearts too? Because I feel like that's the most like real way to do it. Or like, do I, you know, pat it a little bit so that hits. So it's like it's a very interesting, difficult thing. Because like even like when you were talking about current events, like how do we expect the current generation to help like those women who went through that when they don't have the full context of the situation? If we censor anything, but again, like, is it like oversharing to say like, I don't know, like as I'm talking to you right now, I'm kind of processing, like, kind of doing the
conversation,
right, like the back and forth. But no, it's a. I think I like how you said that we don't want to invalidate people who are in that space. I guess you're saying it's not a right thing to just outright say, oh, like, that's wrong. Like, you got to stop being so hateful. Like, there's so many layers that we can't just cut.
Right. And I think I like, you know, when I run into these situations where I don't know if I would ever get to an answer there. Like, I think my faith it just plays a big role, you know, because I don't think like faith, like, I don't think God wants us to ever, lessen or shy away from what is true. And like, you know, these things really happened, you know, and I don't think that just shying away from the atrocity is the right answer. You know, even in teaching about it to your children, like sheltering them just for the sake of sheltering them, right? We see that it's bad. You know, we see that it causes a lot of confusion and identity. You know, and like a desire even for the kids to want to understand the experiences of those that came before them. But like I think because of the gospel and because like it's not like we shy away from how atrocious our sins are before God, right? But like that makes the sacrifice of Christ, right, which is the bonding glue of all nations, right, and even the ones that were oppressors and the oppressed. I think like you don't shy away from the atrocities, but it makes the reconciliation even sweeter, you know, because we see like this is how much you were bad to me, you know, or this was how much I was bad to you, you know. But because of this bonding glue of like the death and resurrection of Jesus, like even those, you know, the division that happens in these kinds of contexts like can be mended, you know, and that's what Christ died for. And so like I've really struggled with my faith, and I think I said this the last time I was talking to you. I struggle with my faith being in this field because like it's not just, you know, mental health. Like, you know, I am getting such an interdisciplinary education because like these things, historical events or cultural events, even current events, you know, like it impacts how we psychologically operate today, you know. And I've just had a lot of questions like to God that I couldn't answer, right? But like it's always led me back to like the gospel and that being truly the truth and the life and the way, in a way that I would have never been able to really like have applied if I wasn't going through this training, you know. No,
because I was gonna ask, it's you know how you mentioned like there are people who are like, oh, I can pray away this anxiety or like this depression, which, you know, like if you like just kind of take our faith at face value, doesn't sound like a negative thing. You know what I mean? So like how have you kind of navigated that?
I'm still navigating it. I haven't felt like, okay, this is what to do now, but I think so the human being is made up of three components: body, soul, and spirit. And all of these things were created by God, and you know the spirit is deposited into us when like we profess our belief in Christ. But that doesn't mean like you stop living in your physical body, and it also doesn't mean that you suddenly don't have a soul. And the soul is comprised of your will, mind, and emotions. And so the aspects that really make us who we are, right, even our personalities, that's like all kind of housed within the soul. And I think like there can be a spiritual issue and there can be a soul issue with things like depression or anxiety or even PTSD, right? Some of these kind of like internal ills. And we wouldn't tell someone who has cancer to pray away their cancer, right? Like, and I've heard of stories of people who have cancer and they have such faith that God's going to heal them that they don't go get chemo or radiation, you know, and then they die of the cancer. And so, like we want to navigate these spiritual conversations, I think, with like a lot of caution and like consultations with people that are in the mental health field, right? Like I think our spiritual leaders don't do that well because they want the answer to be what they know, which is like ministry or theology or prayer, like these ways of God. But you know, like I think healthcare is a common grace, right? Like for God, for his creation, from God for his creation. And mental health looks a little bit different because it's like soul healing, soul care. But that is important. And those things should go in junction with one another, not have it be submitted in a really hierarchical way as if like one is not needed because of the other. So like I think for folks kind of in the Christian community, you should be praying for your depressed friend, you know, like God can work in whatever ways he wants to. He can definitely come in that person's room and just lift that depression off. Like I don't think he's outside of that, you know, but also like it's not sinful to be taking antidepressants and going to therapy, you know, like just like it's not sinful to go get radiation and chemo if you have cancer, you know, and I know I'm comparing pretty extreme like examples, but you know, it really is like, if you think about it in like your body, physical health care, right? There are ways that feel so much more acceptable than soul care looks like. And I think it would be good for folks to ask, like, why is that?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I'm a huge advocate. I went to counseling because I was like feeling anxious, and I, as a person of faith myself, I went to someone who was Christian as well, and something she said to me that still I like think about it and it's like so good is a lot of my anxiety was kind of tied to the fact of tied to my identity as a father and a husband and like wanting to provide and like feeling anxiety over like what happens if I can't provide and like what happens to my daughter if I lose my job, you know, these kind of things. And she said to me, because she's a Christian, because I'm a Christian, she said, like, do you feel like you're giving like enough room for God to be God, or are you trying to replace God in your daughter's life?
That's good.
And I was like, oh gosh, that like hit me. Yeah, like that's 100% right. So like like I wouldn't have been able to get that insight and kind of reframe like how I think about these things if I hadn't sought help, you know. So I totally agree. I think this weird like stigma of Christians not seeking out mental health help, I think needs to go.
Yeah.
So sorry, I know this is such a great conversation that I could take it 1,000 different ways, but I wanted to take it back to your chapter 2 of your dissertation. So when you talk about, you mentioned the timing of intervention. So for example, for me and my parents, is it too late to like open up dialogue to kind of get rid of this the conspiracy of silence, or like if it is too late, like what are the most beneficial times to do that, to have that intervention?
No, it's not too late. I don't think it's ever too late, you know, to try to make every effort for conversations that are healing, you know. And so at first, actually, when I was designing my intervention, I really wanted it to also serve and benefit the first generation. But, you know, I have time constraints of when I would need to defend this by. And so like my dissertation, I'm just kind of seeing it as like the first step into the specialty that I really care about, because it came about after I got some pretty extensive training on trauma and PTSD. I used to work at the Atlanta VA, so I was treating patients with PTSD and like comorbid disorders that were veterans, you know, so combat, war, rape, like military sexual trauma. And so like my project kind of was birthed from like knowing what really works with trauma. And at first I was like, I gotta tell everyone, you know, like I have to go talk to all the harmonies that, you know, like whatever. And I was super excited, but I unfortunately met some limitations. But like, so there's definitely ways that I think the first generation can also be initiative of these conversations. But for us, like, it's not too late. And I think it just starts with intentionality, you know, like, I think it's good, again, first to have context into the first generation experiences. And you can get that from the educational pieces, right? But even just knowing what you know, right? Like you said, you knew when your parents were stressed or there were things that were overwhelming. But there was never a conversation about the why, right? And now as like a husband and father yourself, there's like, you know, you face some of that, I think like hardship with being a provider and wanting to be financially, you know, stable for your family. And I'm really glad, first of all, that your therapist kind of shared that with you, because I would imagine that took a lot of the burden off. But like, I would bet to say that our parents' generation have never heard those kinds of words, you know? And so even sharing from like your perspective, like, oh, like I was feeling this way and feeling really pressured and burdened and anxious. And like, what was that like experience like for you, you know, dad or mom, right? Like, and it must have been a lot harder for you because of, you know, like I'm not sure if they speak English fluently or not.
Oh, my parents don't.
Okay,
So,
yeah. I never want to assume,
Yeah.
but it must have been harder for you because of the language and like the barriers, and you're navigating a whole new country. Like I've lived here all my life, so I relatively know like how to file taxes and Medicaid and Medicare, but like that must have been so hard to like figure out, and just getting their stories, and seeing like how their dynamic with their parents were, right? And because they are also somebody's child. And I think navigating that with intentionality, especially if you have understanding as like a husband and father, I think that even gives you like a greater advantage of like really being able to connect in a meaningful way. Yeah.
Also, like the more closer you are in life stage to your parents' life stage, it might be beneficial.
I think there's pros and cons for sure.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. So it sounds like to me like the key thing for our community, who are, like in terms of intergenerational trauma, people who are trying to kind of heal from that. It sounds like one of the key things is just communication. Is that right?
Yeah.
So if you had to the general audience, give one piece of advice as to how to start maybe, or even like maintain that communication, like what would it be?
Yeah. Gosh, one piece of advice. That's hard. I'm gonna probably say a very long run-on sentence.
It can be many pieces of advice. Yeah.
I think it's first to know that like these experiences aren't isolated, and there is kind of camaraderie even in the things that you experience. Your parents have probably also experienced it too, and I think it does take a certain level of age to see your parents as human beings, but that's why I think the second generation is really well equipped to be able to have these conversations. Because like we're about, at least in the Gen Z, like Gen Z generation, they're in their 20s now, right? And so like there is an aspect of it like where you can see your parents as like flawed individual humans that are in need of God's grace, just like yourself. And if you approach these conversations from that place, then I think it's helpful and healthy. And I think it's a universally shared trait that all humans want their stories heard, they want to be listened to and heard and validated and connected with, like God made us that way. He made us to be known and know others. And I think a lot of the times, especially in Asian families, the dynamic between the parent and child is like the child gets. And there's never like a connection in terms of like, okay, like I want to hear you, and I want you to hear me. And this feels really impossible because like either when parents are emotional, they are usually dysregulated, kind of like the example with your dad, because they stuff it down so much. And so I've never had an intentional or meaningful conversation with you, so this is awkward. But I think getting over that hump, there's so much that's waiting for you, like, and your parents, and like so much relational depth and richness, reconciliation and connection, that it's just like, I think it's just worth getting over the awkwardness for. And so to know what's on the other side and the why, which is to, right, like build this bridge between you and your parents that you might never have a chance to do if you don't approach with intentionality. I think that's a reward in and of itself. But, even like as like not a parent yet, like when I think about how I want to raise my children, I want to do it in a way where I'm gleaning the good things from my parents, right? And there is, this bridge between the generations. And I think that's uniquely possible also more in collectivistic cultures than individual ones. And I want that legacy to pass on, the good things of it. So yeah, I think, I don't know if that was concise enough.
No, that was great. That was great because for me personally, I've been talking to my wife about a project I want to do where I actually want to sit my dad down with me and then have him share and record his story.
Wow.
One, because I feel like I don't really know it. Two, the way I'm going to sell it is like, I want your grandkids to know your story from you.
Love it.
And then three, I think it's because it's easier to have those conversations when there's a purpose.
Yeah,
Like-
there's like a context.
Right.
It's not at dinner.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
like for me and you, like this conversation, I would have loved this conversation even if it wasn't for the podcast. But it's much easier to be like, hey, like let's have this conversation because
Yeah.
it's a podcast and
Yeah.
we can share it with other people. So I'm hearing that that's a good idea.
Yes.
What I'm about to do. Okay.
Strong support.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
For
that's awesome.
sure.
That's awesome. So
Yeah.
it's over an hour, and I want to respect your time. But before I let you go, I want to ask you about one thing. It's something that I've observed about myself recently, and thinking back, I'm like, oh, I do this a lot, and I guess it's kind of like a confession too. But one thing I realize I do is when I'm in a non-Korean setting. Because like a lot of our lives, it's like with family or at church, like a Korean American church, we're in a Korean setting, so we can be comfortable. But in like a more diverse setting, I realize I do this thing where I intentionally speak more to prove that I know English.
Oh.
You know what I mean? So that like our family, like I think, like, and I've been thinking about it, right? So I think that like one of the reasons is because I don't want to be looked at as someone who doesn't know the language and therefore be looked down upon.
Yes.
Reactions.
Yes. I relate.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I mean, I already talk a lot Korean or non-Korean, but there is an aspect of it for me too that I feel like it's like from a chip on my shoulder, you know? And first, I understand like that's like okay, but we like, I don't know. I think like that makes me sad, you know, that makes me sad that there is an aspect of it that we still have this lack of sense of belonging. And that's perpetuated both by the larger society because Asian Americans are, you know, erased in a lot of ways, our identities, our cultures, our historical presence in the US. But also it's this like internal thing, right? Internal place of insecurity because we never really know if we have belonged, you know? And I think that is like very characteristic of the second generation experience. Like, I don't feel like I'm Korean when I go to Korea, you know? And as soon as people find out that I am, like, I live in the US, even though I speak Korean, like, well enough that people don't think I'm like a, you know, foreigner, they're like, oh my gosh, can you say something in English? And I'm like, oh my God, you know, it's like I just have such a weird warped experience of the same things I experienced in the US. Like, oh my gosh, can you say this in Korean? You know, like, so I hear you. I think that is just kind of the in between that we like will always live in. But I would ask, like, if I were you, I would ask myself, has there been an experience, whether it's at this company or any other like work setting, that has made me feel inferior, that has made me feel like I have to like do more, right? Excel more or be noticed more. And I would kind of process through that memory because like even the language thing, it's probably just like a fruit of like that experience and not because of like your actual insecurity about speaking English because you speak English great, you know?
So it's weird because it actually happened at like Universal Studios. Like it was at a theme park. Like we were just like sitting down eating.
With your coworkers?
No, it was nothing to do with. That's interesting that you think that. 'Cause
Oh,
it was,
oh really? It's because it's like that for me. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Oh,
I'm at
that's
school. I'm like,
that's interesting. No, it might have to do with the fact that it was my Korean cousins came to visit like 2 weeks ago, like straight from Korea. So obviously we were speaking Korean, but then I think in that like we were sitting down eating, and then
wow, so it was just in your like free time.
Yeah.
Oh
so,
wow,
like,
that's even more interesting.
Yeah, because like I would as we're like talking, hanging out, like I would intentionally say things that I could easily say to my wife in Korean. But I would switch it up to English and like make my like diction like perfect, right? Use like big
R.
words, right? Like
L.
Like I am a native like English speaker, kind of like to kind of try to prove that. I don't know, and to like think about that question, I don't know. I would have to think deep to see if there was something that happened in that context. But it's when you said the whole othering thing, it did feel like I was at like something that I think I could explain to someone is like if I was at like a Hawks game and like I see that everyone around me is a Hawks fan because they're wearing all the jerseys. It was me speaking English was the act of me putting on a Hawks jersey.
Yeah.
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 Like, to make sure everyone there
Like
knew I was one of
knew.
them, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like when you kind of reflect on that, like that memory, what was the hypervigilance about? Like, if they didn't think, you know, you were a native speaker, you didn't speak English, right?
Oh, that's interesting question. I think it was about protection for like my family and my cousins. Like almost as if like if all of us are othered, then something could happen to us.
Okay.
But if they know that at least I'm one of them,
Yeah.
then like we won't be a target for something.
Okay. What kind of danger do you think your family could have faced?
You know, oh, okay, I know what it is. So this brings me to a memory I have. I've talked about this on the podcast a few times, so if you're a regular listener, sorry, bear with me. But when I was in elementary school, we were living in LA, and my mom had parked her car like on the side of our apartment, and me and my brother were coming out to get into the car, but her window was open like this much, and some kid like threw a water balloon at her, and like she got wet. So we knew exactly where they lived. So my mom was like, we're gonna go to the like apartment like complex office and complain about those neighbors. But when we went there, like we couldn't really articulate it well. Like even though like and me and my brother we were speaking the language, but imagine like a middle-aged woman like speaking something, and then like her two like elementary school kids like trying to yeah. So like I don't remember that getting resolved that well.
Wow.
So I wonder if it's something like that, like trying to protect my family from something like that from happening.
Yeah. That makes sense because, like, I think I said this actually on the last episode I was on, but you know, our parents come to this country and they're deaf and they're mute, you know, and they're navigating a system that they're completely unfamiliar with, and that leads to a lot of experiences of powerlessness. And even as a child, experiencing your mom being powerless in that situation when she was clearly like targeted. That's hard because we identify our mothers primarily as our caregivers. And so when you're powerless, I'm powerless, right? And so like, and a lot of folks, you know, from the Korean community and a lot of like, you know, Asian communities, we grow up with like, we have to never be powerless, right? But that's hard because we are still, you know, we're still marginalized, and there are still experiences that we go through that folks that are not from immigrant backgrounds don't have to go through. But it's even that, right? It's a form of like mini trauma, right? It's like a lowercase t, because like that could lead to danger. You know, it was a water balloon, but what if it wasn't? You know, and that kind of hypervigilance is actually one of the symptoms of PTSD, right? Always feeling like I'm gonna be in danger, so I have to like overcompensate, or I have to like avoid certain things, or you know. So yeah.
Wow. You know what's funny?
Yeah.
I sometimes I say something to my wife about like her not being vigilant enough. I'm like, hey, can you be more self-aware? Like so that's that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, men experience this more because they are by nature more like protectors, right? But there's aspects of it that is also, I think, like culturally informed.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was meant
That's another episode.
Yeah, no, that was meant to be a quick question. Yeah, well, good luck on finishing up your dissertation. Thank you so much for making the time to be here, and I'm sure I'm going to invite you again, because I feel like we just scratched the surface today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
For any listeners, if they're curious, are you okay with them reaching out to you?
Yeah, for sure.
I'll drop your email in the episode description, but thanks guys for listening, and wow, thanks for the conversation. That was amazing.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. Talk to you guys later, guys.
Bye.
Talk to you guys later, guys. What is that?